There are a lot of rules for commas, and that's why it may seem overwhelming at first to try to tackle this subject. But I think if we slow down and we talk about each rule kind of by itself, then over time you'll get more used to commas, and they will really help you to organize your thoughts and create more complex and interesting sentences. So in this video, we're just going to talk about some general rules for what commas do, and then we'll zoom into a couple of specific rules as well. First thing to recognize is that we don't use commas just to indicate a longer pause. Obviously, that's partly why we use commas. So if you look at this example, there's quite a difference between the first one here, the first sentence, which reads, "Time to eat, mum," and the second one, "Time to eat, mum." If you were to say the first one, people might think you're a cannibal, whereas in the second one, it's clear that it's dinner time or lunchtime or something like that. Okay, so the comma does indicate a pause of some kind, but commas do much more than that. They create clarity, and they work with clauses and phrases especially, and sometimes individual words, to set these units off from the rest of the sentence. And that's really what we want to focus on. We want to have a good sense of the structure of the sentence, the way the words, phrases, and clauses work. And then if we have that knowledge, commas should actually be quite a bit easier. So in this video, then, we're just going to talk about two of these kind of sentence patterns and how we can use commas in relation to them. The first sentence pattern we'll have a look at here is where we have two independent clauses. So we're just going to map this out here. Independent clause. And then we have another one later. And we've connected these two independent clauses with a coordinating conjunction. And you might remember the coordinating conjunctions. They are the fanboys, if you recall. So or, for, nor, and, but, and, yet, and so. Now, here's the rule. If you have these two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, you typically put a comma just before the coordinating conjunction. And you can see that in our first example here. So where it says, "Did you have a good sleep?" That's a complete sentence. You could put a question mark right there already. And then we have or. There's our coordinating conjunction. And then we have our second independent clause, which reads, "Were you troubled by bad dreams?" And what you can check then is that each clause is an independent clause. So just read it by itself, make sure it has a subject and a verb, and if it does, then you can put the comma right before before or whatever the coordinating conjunction may be. So far so good. You do have to watch out though. If you look at the second example here, it reads, "Tristan hated commas and would do almost anything to avoid them." So you can see we have a coordinating conjunction, but is it really between two independent clauses? Well, the first one here has a verb, hated, and it has a subject in Tristan, and it even has a nice direct object here. So yes, that's an independent clause. Afterwards, it says would do almost anything to avoid them. You can probably tell that there's a verb here, would do, but who would do? There's no subject. So the subject is being carried over from earlier. It's still Tristan, but there's no subject grammatically in this part of the sentence. And as a result, we cannot put a comma before and, because these are not two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. So what we can do then is just leave the comma out and carry on with our sentence. And what you're watching out for here is that sentence pattern where you have a subject and you have two sets of verbs. Okay, and we don't want to put commas in between these verbs. This is the basic rule then that we're seeing, but you can sometimes depart from it. And that's one of the big things to learn about commas, that these are not always hard and fast rules. The whole point of writing is that you learn to write naturally, as is sort of the mantra for this website. And writing naturally means thinking about what you're actually saying. So you can't just always say, well, here's the rule and I'll apply it. You have to look at the context. And so we'll look here briefly at two more examples that show how sometimes you're allowed to break the rule. So in the first place, if you look at this third example here, my wife loves coffee, independent clause. I don't. It's a very short clause, but it's still independent. we've used a coordinating conjunction in between, but because the clauses are so short, we've decided just to leave the comma out, and that's okay. The last example, here we go, Tom built his own airplane, independent clause. We have but, coordinating conjunction, and failed to fly it. And you can probably see what's wrong here. Failed is a verb, but it follows this pattern, right? So there's no subject here. The subject is Tom, which is over there, and it's on the wrong side of the coordinating conjunction. So what should we do about this? Well, presumably we should not have a comma here then. That comma should go. But here's the thing. If you find that that comma sounds better because there's sort of a gap in between the two parts of the sentence, especially if time passes, so we could sort of see Tom building his airplane and then many days later he tries to fly it. Well, if there's that kind of temporal gap or there's some kind of space between in terms of the ideas, then you are allowed to put that comma there, and that's totally fine. So we have a general rule, in other words, independent clause, comma, coordinating conjunction, independent clause, but as we saw, sometimes you're allowed to break the rule. And that brings us to our second rule, which is that you're allowed to use a comma after an introductory phrase. So in each of these examples, we've used an introductory phrase, or sometimes just a word. It can be a longer phrase as well. And we'll look at this last one in a moment. It doesn't have a comma. But in each case, we have followed up the introductory phrase with a comma. And there are all sorts of introductory phrases. So the first one here is a prepositional phrase. Prepositional phrase. So after is the preposition, and her shower is the object of the preposition. And then we use a comma and we get to our main clause. Same thing with the second one. Well, it's not a prepositional phrase this time, but it is an introductory phrase, and in this case we have used simply a conjunctive adverb. So conjunctive adverb looks a little bit like a regular conjunction, and it allows us to nicely introduce the main clause. The third example here has a number of phrases. So we start with having seen the desire, and having seen here, you can see here that's a participial phrase. And then we also have in his eyes. This is getting a bit messy here. In his eyes is a prepositional phrase. So we've got a few phrases in a row, and when we get to the end of all these phrases, we've added the comma, and then we get to the main clause after that. Now, as we said before, sometimes you're allowed to break the rule, and that applies here as well. So if you find that that introductory phrase blends very nicely or moves really nicely into the main part of your sentence, then you can leave out the comma. And the example here shows that. So if you were to say, in the end they lost, and you think, well, there really is no pause there, it just nicely moves into the rest of the sentence, then leave out the comma, and that's totally fine. So a couple of rules to start us off with. Try to master these rules, and then we'll move on to some other rules for commas in the later videos as well.